My name is Alexander, and for more than 20 years I have been working as a gamekeeper in the Altai Mountains. My site is located near Lake Teletskoye, not far from the village of Artibash. This is an amazing place where the mountain taiga meets the crystal-clear waters of an ancient lake, where the Corbu Ridge rises majestically above the valley of the Chulishman River. But you should not be deceived by this beauty. The taiga does not forgive mistakes and inattention. I came here quite young, thinking that I knew everything about the forest. The locals only laughed at my self-confidence. Now I understand why. Here in these mountains I have encountered things that I would not have believed myself if someone had told me them before. I am Russian, but married to an Altai woman, and over the years I have become deeply imbued with the local culture, traditions, and legends of these places. Here every trail has its own history, every mountain has its own character. I know every stream, every animal trail, every bunkhouse in my area. I know all the hunters, shepherds, and locals. Some of them have become close friends. Some of them are no longer alive. A gamekeeper's work is not just a service. It is a way of life. We are guardians of these places, protectors of nature and its laws. During the years of service, I have seen many things. Fights with poachers in bitter cold, unexplained incidents in the mountains, terrible tragedies and amazing cases of rescue. I lost friends and found new ones. I learned to respect these places and understand their harsh laws. Some of these stories I want to tell you. Each of them left its mark not only in my memory but also in my soul. And let not all of them end well, but they are all part of my life, part of this great taiga. I remember this story as clearly as if it happened yesterday. Standing on the porch of the cordon, I was checking my gear for the umpteenth time. Matches in a waterproof container, a spare flashlight, a walkie-talkie. The metal clasp of my backpack burned even through my gloves from the bitter frost. The thermometer on the wall showed -45. On days like this, even breath freezes in the air, turning into prickly snow dust. Around noon, through the crackle of interference, I heard the excited voice of a forester from the neighboring area. He noticed snowmobile tracks in the restricted area. I immediately realized that it was poachers. Only they could go on a snowmobile in such cold weather, and I guessed why. At this time of year they hunt musk deer. More precisely, the musk gland of the males. They sell it to China for a lot of money. When I found the first traces of blood on the snow, my suspicions were confirmed. I didn't know then that this night would become one of the most intense nights of my career. The trail led deeper into the tract. The sun was already sinking and the frost was getting even worse. I walked cautiously, listening to every sound. Traces of blood came more and more often. The musk deer had been hit, but not killed. When I saw smoke from the chimney of the old hut, I realized that it was too late to retreat. A snowmobile, covered with fresh snow, was standing at the entrance to the hut. Smoke was rising from the chimney, smelling of roasted meat and tobacco. The dim light of a kerosene lamp shone through the frozen window. Voices were clearly audible in the frosty air. There were 3 of them. "Tomorrow we'll kill one more and that's enough," said one roughly. "Wait a minute. You're too risky," replied another, younger, with a hoarseness in his voice. The third was silent. I tried to sneak up to the snowmobile to get the keys. In the pitch darkness, every crunch of snow seemed deafening. Suddenly the door creaked open. One of them had gone out for a bathroom break. I barely had time to hide behind the logs, pressing myself into the frozen timbers. It was the silent third. As he passed by, he suddenly stopped and said quietly, as if into the void, "We're here for nothing." I told you it was bad luck. My heart was pounding so hard that it seemed to be audible in the frosty silence. By dawn, I had a plan. When the first rays of the sun tinted the snow pink, I walked defiantly out to the hut as if I had just discovered it on my rounds. My clothes creaked from the night's cold, and the frost on my eyelashes made it hard to look. He introduced himself. said that a task force was working in the district to check reports of poachers. A bluff, of course, but in such cold weather, far from dwellings, even the most desperate scoundrels lose their nerve. The leader, a stocky man with a red, weathered face, was immediately rude. The young ones smoked one after the other, and the third one suddenly stepped forward. "Commander, let's settle this amicably. You're right. We don't belong here." There was a heavy silence in the hut. I could feel the chief glaring at me, considering his options. His hand slowly reached for his pocket. I noticed the fabric of his jacket tighten. There was obviously a knife or something heavy in the pocket. "Okay," I spoke slowly and clearly, keeping my hand on the walkie-talkie. "You have two options. One, you surrender your booty and I'll pretend we never met. The second is I wait for the task force and then I'll go to the full extent of the law. Decide now." The young man looked nervously from me to the ringleader, and the latter still did not remove his hand from his pocket. Suddenly, the third, who had been silent until then, put his palm on the ringleader's shoulder. "Enough, Mikalish. It's the wrong time now, the wrong places. The gamekeeper is talking." The chief twitched his shoulder, but took his hand out of his pocket. "All right," he gritted his teeth. "Take your glands. Just keep in mind—" "No threats," the third man interrupted him. "Let's pack up and leave." While they were taking out their loot and stowing their gear, this third one happened to be beside me as if unintentionally. "Listen, Chief," he said quietly as he continued to stow his gear. "There's some abandoned equipment up there on the northern pass. None of our business, of course, but we should check it out. It's not a good place up there." I nodded silently, memorizing the information. There was something like an apology in his eyes. When everything was over and the poachers left, I stood near the hut for a long time, looking after them. The frost was getting to my bones, but there was some emptiness inside. That day I realized that my work is not just about nature conservation. It is about the choice that each of us makes when we find ourselves alone with the temptation of easy profit. The call came in the early morning hours. The administration of the reserve informed me that a scientific expedition was arriving, and they needed an experienced guide. I was to accompany a group of geologists to a hard-to-reach area to study seismic activity. The head of the expedition was Viktor Andreevich Klimov, a well-known geologist and doctor of sciences. He was gray-haired, trim, with a keen eye and a shabby leather jacket. In his gait, despite his limp, I could feel his considerable field experience. Later I learned that he was the only survivor of the '88 expedition in Yakutia. Klimov never told me about what happened there, in the mountains, but sometimes, looking at certain places in the mountains, he would somehow strangely freeze and his gaze would become absent. I didn't pay much attention to this detail at the time, nor did I pay much attention to the fact that the birds suddenly stopped singing when our group of 12 entered the narrow gorge. At that time, I did not know that this expedition would become one of the most terrible pages in my life. The first day passed calmly. The group moved smoothly. Geologists installed sensors. Seismologists made measurements. Students, practitioners diligently took notes. 2 experienced guides from the locals were with us in case we had to split up. I remember how one of them, having lived all his life in the mountains, suddenly said, "There's something wrong here. There are no sounds." He was right. There are always sounds in the mountains. The rustling of small stones, the whistling of the wind, the cries of birds. But here there was an unnatural silence. Only the instruments began to make a strange beeping sound from time to time, but quickly fell silent. By the evening of the second day, we climbed to a height of about 2 kilometers. The wind, which did not subside all day, suddenly stopped. In this unnatural silence, I noticed a strange detail. The grass in the lowlands was muffled, as if something invisible had pressed on it. And then one of the students saw the carcass of a morel deer. The animal was lying without any visible damage, as if it had just fallen asleep. Nearby they found several other small animals, all in the same pose. Klimov turned pale. I saw his fingers digging into the handle of his cane. He sharply ordered everyone to put on respirators from the emergency kit and prepare for immediate departure. But it was too late. One of the students, the one who had found the morale, suddenly staggered to the ground. The second student rushed to help him. In the next few minutes, everything turned into a nightmare. Both students lost consciousness and started convulsions. The other members of the expedition tried to help, but soon they too were experiencing symptoms. Even through the respirator, I could smell a strange odor that made my throat sore and dizzy. The seismologist's instruments suddenly came to life, their beeping turning into a continuous howl. "Everyone go higher immediately!" Klimov's voice sounded like a whiplash. "The gas is heavier than air. It's filling the lowlands. Faster!" My guides and I began to lift the injured. Each step was difficult. Sharp stones were torn from under our feet, crumbling down with a deafening thud. Cold sweat poured into our eyes. Our hands trembled with tension. They had to practically drag the lifeless bodies down the slope, clinging to the sparse bushes growing between the rocks. Klimov, despite his limp, helped the geochemist, who could barely stand on his feet. His walking stick remained somewhere down in the poisonous valley. We lost the first student right there on the slope. He just stopped breathing. The second one fell into a coma before the ME's helicopter arrived. He died a week later in intensive care. 3 members of the expedition suffered severe lung injuries and were nursed in hospital for a long time. Later, it turned out that there was a release of natural gas from a fault in that place. This happens in the mountains, but such a powerful release is incredibly rare. Klimov knew about this phenomenon. Now I understood why he never told me about that Yakut expedition. Sometimes I go back to that valley, from afar, of course. Grass still doesn't grow there, and the birds avoid the place. And the instruments, they say, sometimes start showing strange readings, but they don't let anyone else in there. 2 crosses on the mountainside are the best warning for anyone who would like to explore these places. Everybody knew Vasily Petrovich, a hunter in our place. A hereditary fisherman, he had walked through this taiga with his father and knew every trail. He was never greedy. He took exactly as much as he needed to live. He was an old-school man. He didn't carry a compass. He preferred to walk by the stars. "The taiga loves a smart man," he always said. When his dog came running alone, I immediately realized that something serious had happened. The old dog, with graying on his face, never abandoned his master. We organized a search. We waited until dawn and went out. Me, 2 local hunters, and a tracker from a neighboring district. The weather was strange. The fog was swirling in the lowlands, but it was unusual, thick, almost tangible. In the tract where Vasily Petrovich usually hunted, the fog was especially dense. The dogs, which we had taken to search for the trail, huddled at our feet and whimpered. Even the bravest of them refused to go forward. We found the tracks quickly, clear prints of familiar hunting boots on the wet ground, but they broke off on the rocky plateau as if by themselves. We searched all around. Nothing. One of the hunters, Nikolai, suddenly froze, listening. "Do you hear?" We fell silent. Through the fog came something like distant singing or crying. At that moment, an old man emerged from the mist, small, with deep-set eyes. I knew him. A local shaman, rarely came down to see people. He slowly approached us and said in a mixture of Russian and Altaic, "The spirits have taken the man." For disrespect, we didn't believe it at first, but the old man told us Vasily Petrovich had recently violated an ancient prohibition. He had cut down an old tree on a sacred site, taking away the offerings left there by the locals. "The land here is special," the shaman said. "It doesn't forgive such things." He pulled a time-darkened tambourine from his shoulder bag. The first blow echoed through the gorge. The shaman began to hum softly. His voice, low and vibrating, seemed to rise from the earth itself. With each beat of the tambourine, the air grew heavier, as if an invisible press was pressing down on his shoulders. After a few minutes, the fog began to dissipate. I couldn't believe my eyes, but I kept myself thinking it was a coincidence. We stood there, not daring to move. The dogs pressed themselves to the ground. Gradually, the singing grew louder. The rhythm quickened, and each beat of the tambourine echoed somewhere in my chest. It seemed that the mountains themselves were listening to this ancient tune. And suddenly, a sharp silence, so deep that it rang in the ears. We found Vasily Petrovich 300 meters away from the place where his footprints had broken off. He was unconscious, but alive. When he woke up in the hospital, he told us strange things. He said that he had been wandering for several hours, always returning to the same place. There was fog all around, and some shadows were moving in it. It was as if time had stopped for him. He was sure that no more than a couple of hours had passed, but in fact, it had been 3 days. We found his compass later. The hand rotated randomly when it was brought to that place. Specialists said something about magnetic anomalies that happen in the mountains. Vasily Petrovich changed a lot after that incident. He gave up hunting, and a year later he went to his children in the city. Only sometimes he comes, sits on the porch of his old house, looking at the mountains. And that place, well, there's a sacred tree there again, and no one touches the offerings at its roots anymore. The call from the shepherds woke me at dawn. I could hear the alarm in their voices. The sheep were refusing to go to their usual pasture in the valley. I did not pay much attention to it. Animals often sense the approach of bad weather or a predator, but when I reached the place, I realized that it was more serious. There was a fog hanging over the valley, not the usual morning mist, whitish and transparent, but a thick, reddish fog. It drifted over the ground like a living thing, filling all the lowlands. There was a strange odor in the air that made my throat chill. Standing on a hill, I saw a pack of wolves running away from the valley, ignoring the sheep grazing nearby. I had never seen anything like it before. Moving against the wind, I began to descend toward the source of the fog. With each step, the odor became stronger and it became harder to breathe. On the slope, I noticed tracks, wide ruts from a truck. They led to a bend hidden behind the rocks. Around the bend, I saw a terrible sight. The truck was lying on its side, crumpled, as if it had been rammed by something huge. Metal containers labeled with chemical hazard labels were scattered around. Some of them were damaged, and that's where that red mist was oozing from. I found the driver 30 meters away from the car. His posture spoke volumes. He was trying to escape. His face, distorted by agony, had taken on a livid hue. The ground around the body showed deep furrows. The man was clawing at the ground in convulsions, trying to take his last breath. I immediately called the emergency services and cordoned off the area with the help of local hunters. The red mist continued to spread across the valley. Specialists arrived and determined that the truck was carrying components for pesticide production. More precisely, as it later turned out, a delayed-action war gas used in Vietnam. On contact with the air, it formed this red mist, causing paralysis of the respiratory system in a matter of minutes. The driver turned out to be a black hauler, carrying the deadly cargo illegally. Perhaps he didn't fully realize how dangerous his cargo was, or maybe he simply relied on Russian avos. In any case, the price of such carelessness was too high. The valley was cordoned off, the truck and containers were removed by special services. But for several more months there was no grass growing there, and the animals avoided the place. And since then, when I meet trucks with chemical labeling on mountain roads, I always wonder what they are really carrying, And how many more such black carriers are on our roads? Mikhail Petrovich was not just an old hunter. He was a living legend of these places, one of the last representatives of that generation of taiga hunters, for whom taiga was not just a place of work. It was a home, a friend, a teacher. He had once taught me to read tracks, to understand the voices of birds, to feel the breath of the mountains. That morning he came to me unusually early. He stood at the threshold, leaning on an old rifle, and looked somewhere over the mountains. "Come with me, Sasha. I want to show you something." There was something in his voice that made me not ask unnecessary questions. Only on the way he told me, the doctors gave him a month. Lung cancer, terminal. But he'd lived for 3 months, endured the pain, waited for this very day. "Today is a special day," he said, climbing up the mountain path with such ease, as if there was no illness. "On days like this, the taiga opens its doors. We walked all day. He showed me places I didn't even know were there. Ancient hunting trails, sacred stones, springs with crystal-clear water lost in the forest. He told stories about old hunters, about sacred places, about those times when the taiga was different. His words sounded not just nostalgia. It was the wisdom of a man who had lived a long and honest life. By evening, we reached the old hunting lodge. "This is where I spent my best years," he said, sitting down on a fallen tree. He took a thermos of tea out of his backpack, poured it into mugs, and then he began to talk. About his father, about his first hunt, about how he met his wife, how he raised his children. He talked for a long time, as if in a hurry to share everything he knew. During the night he got worse. I could see how hard he was breathing, but he wouldn't let me call for help. "We'll wait till dawn," he said. And at dawn he asked me to help him climb a small rock nearby. From there was a view of the entire valley, the mountains stretching to the horizon. There, on the rock, he said something in Altaic, an ancient blessing, as his wife later explained. And then he just sat there, looking at the rising sun. His face was calm and peaceful. When the first rays touched the mountaintops, he exhaled quietly for the last time. I buried him there by the rock, as he had requested. The local hunters put up a memorial sign. His old rifle now hangs in my cabin, a reminder of the man who taught me not just to work in the taiga, but to live in harmony with it. In those places one often sees morale, big and beautiful with luxurious horns. He is not afraid of people, but he does not come close. It just stands on a rock and looks into the distance, as Mikhail Petrovich once did. Locals say that it is the soul of the old hunter that continues to guard his favorite places. I don't know whether it is true or not, but one thing is certain. The taiga remembers those who loved it truly. Many years have passed since I started working as a gamekeeper. The taiga has changed. Somewhere the forest has been cut down, and I can still hear the emptiness where the pine trees used to thunder. Somewhere new roads have been built, but its essence remains the same. It still holds its secrets, still teaches those who are willing to listen. Each of these stories has left its mark. The 2 crosses on the mountainside where the students died are a reminder that nature should not be studied without respect and caution. A sacred tree in the tract where Vasily Petrovich got lost speaks of the power of ancient traditions. The scorched earth in the valley of the red mist warns of the danger of human carelessness. And the old rock where Mikhail Petrovich is laid to rest is a reminder of those who dedicated their lives to these places. I often think about those I've met over the years, about poachers ready to kill for profit, brave scientists who sacrifice their lives to learn, wise old hunters who live by the laws of nature. They are all part of this land, part of its endless history. Now, sitting on the porch of my cabin and looking at the sunset, I realize the main thing. The work of a gamekeeper is not just a service. It is a way of life. It is a duty to this ancient land. And as long as there are people who are ready to keep its secrets and protect its laws, the taiga will live. Friends, this is the end of the story of our gamekeeper. But I still have a lot of questions, and I'm sure you do too. What happened to those poachers? Why did Klimov survive that expedition in Yakutia? What really happened to Vasily Petrovich in the fog? And is the soul of the old hunter really still guarding those places? Or maybe some of you have similar stories. Perhaps your relatives worked as gamekeepers or hunters? Share your stories in the comments. I'm very interested to read them. If you like this story, support the channel by liking and subscribing. There are many more interesting stories ahead about people whose lives are closely connected with wildlife. See you in the next videos.